Hello, and welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center webinar. Today we're going to learn about creating safe and convenient places for people to incorporate bicycling, walking, and other forms of active transportation into daily life to improve health. Our panelists will be sharing information with you all about expanding opportunities for active transportation between home, work, and other everyday destinations and strategies that have been used in communities across the country. My name is Kristen Brookshire, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. I'd like to introduce you to our panelists joining us today. Ken Rose is a senior advisor at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention within the Physical Activity and Health branch of the Division of Nutrition, Physical Activity, and Obesity, and serves as an expert in strategies to promote active living environments through CDC programs. He helps coordinate Active People, Healthy Nation, Creating an Active America together, and works with a wide range of national partners to help implement this initiative. He was also a key contributor to the CDC's transportation and health recommendations and the Surgeon General's call to action to promote walking and walkable communities. Chris Kotitsky is currently a senior advisor at CDC in the same branch and division as Ken. He has previously served as coordinating lead for CDC and Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registries, cross-agency work in the areas of healthy communities, healthy transportation, and healthy homes. External to CDC, Chris currently serves on the Institute for Transportation Engineers Transportation and Health Task Force and has in the past served as an expert consultant on task forces for organizations such as the Urban Land Institute, Project for Public Spaces, and the American Planning Association. He holds an MS in Urban and Regional Planning and is adjunct faculty in Emory University's Rollins School of Public Health. TJ McCourt serves as strategic and long-range planning, manages strategic and long-range planning for the City of Raleigh Parks Department here in North Carolina. He holds a JD in Environmental and Land Use Law from University of Florida, as well as a master's in Urban Planning from Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. His professional work involves analyzing the City of Raleigh's open space goals from a systems perspective, exploring how parks and recreation fit into a broader context for city planning, community development, natural resource protection, and public health. We're grateful to have all of these panelists with us here today. So right now, I'd like to take a few minutes just to cover some housekeeping items. Attendees, if you can hear me, please click the hand icon located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. This will let us know the webinar is working and that you can hear us. So let's see some hands going up. All right. Thank you for that. Looks good. But if for some reason your computer freezes, please reload the website and log back into the program. You'll be able to join the session by reloading. So please note that attendees will not be able to speak during the webinar, though you will have the ability to submit questions and comments using the chat function. Please feel free to ask questions at any time, but we will hold about 20 to 30 minutes for a discussion session after seeing the presentations from our panelists. We will be posting the presentation slides and a recording of the webinar to the PBIC website, so you will be able to look back at anything you missed today. The presentation slides will be available within a couple of days, and the video archive should be available within 1 to 2 weeks. Later today, you will receive a follow-up email from the UNC Highway Safety Research Center with a link that will allow you to generate a certificate of attendance for this webinar. If you are attending the webinar with multiple attendees at your site, please make sure to forward this message to each of them. That email will also contain a link to the website where we will post the materials from today's webinar. This webinar has already been approved by the American Planning Association for 1.5 CM credits. You can check the online AICP event calendar for more information. And while we're mentioning multiple attendees, we just want to take a quick poll to learn about the number of people currently viewing the webinar from one site. So if you could please respond to the poll that we're currently showing on the screen, this will help us give a more accurate count of the viewers we have on our webinar today. So we'll leave the poll open for a few moments here. All right, thank you for submitting your answer there. I also want to let you know that you can learn more about PBIC webinars, both upcoming and archived, on our website, pedbicinfo.org/webinars. And there are a lot of ways to stay informed about upcoming PBIC webinars as we announce these opportunities on Facebook, Twitter, and our newsletter. And if you're using Twitter today and you're posting about the broadcast, you can use the hashtag PBIC webinar. So with that, I want to kick off our webinar today and turn the session over to our first panelists, Ken Rose and Chris Kotitsky. And let me go ahead. We're going to share the screen with them so they can start their presentation. Ken? We can't hear you yet.
There, I'm free now. Good. All right.
Okay.
Awesome. All right, well, thanks, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time today to listen to folks from the public health community talk about how health, and specifically what we're going to talk about today is physical activity, impacts the kind of work that you guys do on a day-to-day basis promoting bicycle and pedestrian-friendly environments. So today we're going to talk a bit about physical activity, and then my colleague Chris Kotitsky is going to talk about a lot of great resources that are available in this area to promote what we call activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations. So what does walking and bicycling really have to do with public health? Well, walking and bicycling are really two very important ways to integrate physical activity into your daily lives. And when you look at the health benefits of physical activity, they are some of the most powerful health benefits that you can accrue. When you think about the types of things that are going to kill you, the things that physical activity addresses almost all of those. So if I was going to advise you to do one thing today to improve your health, it would be to go out and get a walk or ride your bike or do something else to improve your physical activity levels today. And I think that recently we've had research come out that shows that physical activity is not only good for you today, for over a lifespan, as this graphic shows, benefits for kids, benefits for adults, and benefits for people as they grow older. It also now has immediate benefits to your health. So it improves, in kids, for example, their test-taking ability, what we call cognition. And adults, it improves your ability to sleep immediately, as well as reduces short-term feelings of anxiety. And those benefits for adults also apply for older adults. In addition, we have a lot of research that shows that the types of things that you do to improve physical activity opportunities in your communities, or providing safe and easy opportunities for physical activity in your community, has a number of other ancillary benefits. So many of you have heard about the economic benefits that are associated with walkable and bikeable communities. We also see reduced healthcare costs associated with those communities. It also improves safety, as you guys probably know. Reducing speeds that are associated with walkable and bicycle communities are important in reducing speed and thus improving safety. Eyes on the street that are created through walking and biking also improve public safety and reduce crime. And then the ability for people to get physical activity and integrate it into their daily lives improves productivity in the workplace, because we know that people who are physically active take fewer sick days. But the problem is too few people in this country actually get the amount of physical activity that they need, and we define that as 150 minutes a week or 2.5 hours accrued in some form or fashion. And that can occur either in daily bouts, or you can go out and do it all at one time. And then the other thing that's related to recommended levels of physical activity is that if you do higher intensity physical activity, like say you run or you get high intensity bicycling, you actually need a little bit less time. So, but this slide shows that 31 million adults aged 50 or older are completely inactive. That means they don't get any physical activity beyond that of getting off of the couch and going to the kitchen. And only 1 in 5 students and 1 in 5 adults fully meet physical activity recommendations, which means what I said, the 150 minutes a week, but also we recommend 3 days of some kind of strengthening exercise. In addition, we know in partnering with some of national partners that deal with military readiness or national security, that inadequate physical activity is impacting our nation's ability to have readily available soldiers. So, for example, we see that folks coming into the military are unprepared, even if they have, they're not obese. So one of the things you see is that 1 in 4 young adults are too heavy to serve in the military, so they can never even serve in the military because they come in too heavy to do that. But even those that do meet the requirements from a weight perspective, they're at a higher risk of injury once they become active military personnel because of baseline inadequate levels of physical activity when they come into the military. One general recently said that we were talking to that they saw more injuries or well, I'll just say injuries, there's a technical term for this, but in Iraq and Afghanistan from lack of fitness coming into the military. Even though they got fit when they went through basic, that baseline fitness coming into the military contributed to underlying injuries like ACL tears or twisted ankles that took them out of combat. So the military is really worried about the fact that we have low levels of the physical activity in this country. All of this contributes to important bottom line problems. 1 in 10 deaths in this country is associated with inactivity or inadequate levels of physical activity, and $117 billion a year is associated with healthcare costs because of physical inactivity. Put a different way, if everyone in this nation met the 150 minutes a week of aerobic physical activity that they need, then we could see a $117 billion reduction in healthcare costs. And when you think about the level of healthcare costs at the state level when it accrued by Medicare and Medicaid, which are both significant state expenditures, getting a physical activity starts to have some immediate benefits on budget bottom lines in public sector. So, what are we doing at CDC? Well, one of the things that we really believe is important is creating an identity for physical activity. Why? A lot of people know that physical activity is good for you. They may not know how good it is for you. But our goal at CDC is to raise the visibility of physical activity. So we've been working with a number of national partners over the last year or so to create what we're calling Active People, Healthy Nation, creating an active America together. And you can see the website here. Go Google it while you're on the webinar if you'd like to. You can see some materials there. We'll be updating this website with a major update of materials in about a week and a half with a ton of communication materials and other resources that can help. But this is a national movement to get 27 million people more physically active by 2027. And so what that means is that if you're doing nothing right now, we want you to just go do something. Like, do something every week. That may start with just 10 minutes a week of doing something. Walking to your local coffee shop instead of getting in the car and driving. And if you're getting if you're getting moderate levels of physical activity, we want you to go from that moderate level to fully meeting physical activity at 150 minutes a week. So what are we funding at CDC? Well, CDC does have funded partners that we work with across this nation. We fund a program called Racial and Ethnic Approaches to Community Health. The acronym for that in government speak is REACH. And if you're on our website, you can search for it that way. We also fund state health departments. We fund 15 state health departments across this country, as well as we fund cooperative extension or land-grant universities to work through their cooperative extension services to address obesity in counties with 40% more burden there, or 40% more obesity rates in those counties. So what are we funding those counties to do, or funding all of these grantees to do in the area of physical activity and promoting Active People, Healthy Nation? Well, you can see on this slide that we are promoting the latest science around activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations. And so what this means is we went out and we identified about 55 studies in the public health literature that explored what can you do to improve physical activity. So these are quality studies, and basically at the end of the day, in reviewing all of these studies, we determined two things. One, if you want to improve physical activity, you have got to do something with your transportation system. So you have got to establish an activity-friendly route that is safe and accessible to the population. So here you can see some examples on the left-hand side of this. You have to do something from this menu, and you have to do something from the land use and environmental design menu. This is not new news to anyone on this phone call, but it is new news to a lot of people in the public health community from the perspective of people that we work with. So activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations, we recently also identified as effective active routes to schools. That's a sort of related to activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations, but we did a specific look at safe routes to schools, identified that as promoting physical activity. And just yesterday, we released findings that not only do active routes to schools improve physical activity, but they also prove to be cost-effective. So that you should be seeing some of those findings in the general literature and public pretty soon. So this is, how can this help you? So that's kind of the other question is, I'm out there trying to promote walking and biking. How does this Active People, Healthy Nation really help us? It's just another logo. Well, our goal in all of this is, for example, this is some work that's happening in Savannah, Georgia. We just, several of us at CDC just came back from a site visit there literally last week. And our goal is that this brand can help support the efforts that are occurring at the local level to promote active communities. And so Savannah really has embraced Active People, Healthy Nation. They adopted the logo for their own geographic area. As you can see on their Tied to Town urban trail system that they're planning, they've attached the Active People, Healthy Nation logo prominently to the effort. And they've also got a coalition a cross-sector coalition at the local level called Healthy Savannah, and they've adopted Active People, Healthy Nation as a fundamental component of Healthy Savannah. So this is a way that you can bring the health sector in to add to the argument. It's not the only thing that can certainly help, but it is one thing that we hope can help. And also in places where we do have funding, we have these folks are funded to help support this work, as you can see with this master plan on Tide to Town and Savannah's urban trail system. So I'm going to stop here and turn it over to my colleague, Chris Katitsky, and he's going to really kind of review some of the guts of the evidence and like some of the specific resources that are available out there that can help you make this case in your communities. So I will go offline now and let the moderator bring Chris on.
Hello, everybody. First of all, can you hear me? I'll assume we can.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. And the community guide slide is currently displaying?
Yep, looks good.
Excellent. So I'm Chris Katitsky. As was mentioned earlier, I'm an urban planner at CDC. And so I've been working with colleagues here at CDC who support what's known as the Task Force for Community Preventive Services that creates the community guide. And what that is this is the recommendations that CDC makes across a host of different areas that have the strongest evidence. It's been replicated multiple times, and that there is strong confidence that if you do X intervention or activity, then you will get Y public health benefit. And so I'm going to quickly go over some of that Ken mentioned briefly. So the community guide is the product of the Community Preventive Services Task Force, and I throw this slide up only to show the level of expertise that sits on the task force and that makes these recommendations. That the evidence is extremely strong. Specific to our discussion today, we have 3 recommendations that I think would be of interest to you guys and that support the grant programs that Ken was talking about. First, at the macro level, we have the recommendation that Ken talked about related to activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations. And in looking at thousands of studies, the task force identified 90 that were the highest quality studies that were possible, all of which agreed that if you created the activity-friendly routes and that they led to everyday destinations, that you would see an increase in safe physical activity. Ken also mentioned the new active travel to school recommendation, and that was based on 52 high-quality studies that supported the elements that many of you will recognize that we in the US called safe routes to school. The active travel to school term was selected because in some parts of the world, that is the term rather than safe routes to school. And then finally, we have a task force recommendation about social support interventions that's based on 9 studies that shows that things like walking or cycling groups can aid in increasing physical activity. The reason I put all 3 of these stacked together, though, is that what we've found is that you have to create the macro environments before you can address the more micro environments of schools or workplaces. And finally, you have to do both of those things before social support interventions will really be able to have the impact that we need. Having a cycling group will be much more impactful if there's good cycling infrastructure like protected bike lanes in place when the cycling group tries to kick itself off. And I won't stay on this one too long, but this is the announcement about the economic benefits of active travel to school that show that the Safe Routes to School investments do end up producing more economic benefits than their costs. Another review and recommendation process here at CDC is called High 5, which stands for High Impact in 5 years or less. And that process I mentioned because they did a review related to public transit that that showed that it increased physical activity and reduced motor vehicle emissions. And so public transportation support is also a CDC recommendation. In addition to those public health recommendation processes, some of the additional resources that are available in terms of potentially making the case are the Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans, which was just revised last fall, the Surgeon General's call to action to promote walking and walkable communities, and the National Physical Activity Plan. Citations for all of them are in the notes field of the slide, which I think will be made available afterward. So there's the evidence that we can offer you to help make the case. Assuming that you have already made the case, or that you were successful at some point in making the case to yourself or your colleagues or your bosses, there's a host of resources that I quickly want to go through that now exist to implement these evidence-based recommendations. First, for a number of years, we've been partnering with various external groups like the League of American Bicyclists to create the Bicycling and Walking in the United States benchmarking report. And so we just released a few months ago the 2018 benchmarking report. And I mention all of them because across the 6 years, they provide data that you can use to get a sense of the trends. The latest one will, of course, have the latest data, but across all of them, you'll be able to watch trends. And that data is national data, state data, and data for the 50 largest cities. In addition, we've worked with the Safe Routes to School National Partnership to produce 2 state report cards, including the most recent one being the 2018 that you see on the left. And that tells you a little bit about multiple measures of what's going on at a state level related to both Safe Routes to School and larger activities in active transportation. We've also partnered with Transportation for America to produce the set of case studies that you see here on the right, called Measuring What We Value. And that really will show you real world examples of places that are potentially very much like wherever you're currently sitting that have had success in creating the active transportation supportive environments that we're all trying to support. CDC and US DOT several years ago partnered together to create a data tool called the Transportation and Health Tool that has national, state, and metropolitan level data in it that relates to transportation and health. So for those who are working particularly at the metropolitan level, it's a really good source of everything that exists in the data systems that is at that particular level. And the program that both Ken and I work in has created a community strategies page, and this is where we're going to continue to put up resources as we can. Some of the things that are here include an implementation package that talks about the steps that a community might have to go through in order to decide and prioritize on what they were going to work on. And this gets at the 2 tables that Ken showed, the left and the right. You have to decide which strategies from the left and which strategies from the right you're going to do. And so we strongly suggest that you collect information and engage the community in order to decide whether that community really needs improved pedestrian infrastructure or maybe an expanded transit system. So in addition, we have some real world examples on this page, and we have an infographic of what we think of as an average sized town or small city, and a lot of the elements that would make up activity friendly routes towards everyday destinations. And the idea for the image is that it can help all of us explain things to decision makers or members of the public in a little bit more of a digestible fashion. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tools and resources that some of our partners have created in partnership with us. The Urban Land Institute has a Healthy Corridors project, and they have created a a resource for how to build healthy corridors. For many of us, we recognize that we're not going to be able to really have a high impact if we're just focused one block at a time. And for many of us in communities that we work in, there are key corridors, either key commercial corridors or otherwise, that if they were really activated, would in fact have a huge impact. So that's the focus of the Building Healthy Corridors project at ULI, is to create the opportunity for public-private partnerships between developers and others to develop or increase the number of healthy corridors that are out there. There's another report that many of you may be familiar with from the Smart Growth America and the National Complete Streets Coalition, called Dangerous by Design. And much like the benchmarking report, this is a report that's come out periodically for several years that really shows the communities that have the highest level of risk and the highest level of negative outcomes, injuries, and deaths for pedestrians and cyclists. And so I think this can be an excellent, along with the Pedestrian Danger Index, an excellent resource for making the case for why we need to make changes and where we need to focus more of our efforts. The Urban Land Institute, in that same Healthy Corridors project, also looked at what unhealthy corridors would look like and where they are and how you can identify them, so that as you're looking to figure out where you want to create healthy corridors, you may want to find the places that have the most inbuilt risk and also the highest traffic in those areas in order to focus limited resources. Now I'm going to quickly go through some real world examples that hopefully will make a lot of this seem like that it's really doable in communities at all levels. Complete streets policies is one of the policy interventions that we support, and Muskogee, Oklahoma has one of the better complete streets policies in my opinion, because it both makes the aspirational statement that you want to create safe, reliable, efficient, integrated, and connected transportation networks that serve all people of all ages and abilities, but the policy also states exactly how they're going to measure success. And it calls for the municipal staff to report to the elected officials on an annual basis about the linear feet of newer repaired sidewalks and the percentage of transit stops accessible by sidewalks and so forth. And those are key elements to a really successful complete streets policy. At the state level, North Carolina has done an exceptional job creating a resource called their Complete Streets Planning and Design Guidelines. And I hold this out because the state DOT and the State Department of Health came together to create this. And one of the really nice things in it is because North Carolina has very urban areas like Raleigh and Charlotte, but also very, very rural areas. For those who go to the Complete Streets Planning and Design Guidelines, you're going to find guidelines that apply across the whole spatial scale, along with diagrams and real-world pictures of what complete streets would look like in an urban context, a suburban context, an exurban context, and a rural context. So it really shows that there are different things that you have to do in different areas, but that there are very practical and reasonable things that can be done no matter what kind of community that you're working in. One particular planning example that I want to highlight comes from Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. That is a county that's on the edge of Philadelphia, and so it has a small amount of urban Philadelphia and then a good bit of suburban and some rural in it. And they have created a set of plans, starting with the plan that you see on the screen, which is their master plan, and that also cascades down into a walkability plan, a bikeability plan, and a Parks and Rec plan that are all driving towards creating connected communities that lead to vibrant downtowns and other destinations that are accessible by everyone. And by setting up these plans, they're really baking the key ingredients for long-term change into all the activities that the county does moving forward. I strongly suggest you go look at these examples because they really are exceptionally good examples. Design guidelines is another thing that many of you may be familiar with, and in Los Angeles County, they have the model design manual for living streets. And what that does is Los Angeles County has more than 100 municipalities, I believe, in it. And so they've tried to create guidelines at the county level that municipalities of all sizes and types can use as models or just adopt directly, making it easier for some of the smaller places that may not have the staff to invent the kinds of policies that they need. And New York, in a somewhat different way, because the New York Health Department serves all of the boroughs, they've created design guidelines in partnership with their buildings and facilities department, the transportation department, and public health that relate to both building design, building location, and the sidewalk space outside of the buildings, all of which is designed to create more activity supporting environments. Memphis, a different type of community from New York or Los Angeles, has really taken to the pop-up tactical urbanism concept and created what's called MEMFIX, the manual that you see on the left, to support people at neighborhood levels and other places to figure out what kinds of inexpensive, fairly easy initial lighter, quicker, cheaper tactical urbanism kind of interventions like you see on the right might help to figure out what would work and what wouldn't work, and also help people in the communities themselves get a sense of how well things would work before you actually put anything in permanently. There are case examples available at the ULI website that get at a number of the different scales that we've been talking about, and that also highlight, as the first one in Cleveland points out, that the partnerships, the really interesting multi-sectoral partnerships are possible. In Cleveland, the Cleveland Clinic got together with University Hospital and the Cleveland Regional Transit Authority to work on a partnership that's aimed at a particular corridor that serves all of those entities, many of whom are healthcare related. So the residents, and I mean the corporate residents as well as the individuals, all are sensitized to health issues and therefore made really good advocates for the changes along Euclid Avenue. The same thing happened in Rochester along the 2nd Street corridor. And again, these corridor activities often require coalitions and partnerships in support of them. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to TJ.
All right, thank you, Ken and Chris, for your presentations. I'm sure we'll be calling back to some of those resources that Chris just shared as we go through some of the questions we've been receiving from participants. TJ, all right, we see your PowerPoint window.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about one of the programs, our Neighborhood and Community Connections program here in Raleigh, that we've gotten started as a way to take some of the ideas and evidence and resources that Ken and Chris just went over and really put it into action in a way that we're making new investments in our parks, in our greenway trails, and in the infrastructure of the city of Raleigh to create more opportunities for active routes to everyday destinations. And Throughout this presentation, the destination in particular I'm going to be talking about is going to be parks, neighborhood parks near where people live. But really, a lot of the analysis that I'll go through, you can substitute parks out for any other type of destination. If you want to analyze walkability to bus stops, employment centers, there's a lot of alternative applications outside of just the realm of parks and recreation that we've started using, and that we've kind of developed along with some of our other colleagues in other sectors. So please keep that in mind as I go forward through the presentation today. Just one moment, please. Okay, sorry about that. So first and foremost, when we think about park system planning in Raleigh, we think about it in terms of the twin pillars really of access and equity. And while a lot of the data behind this, a lot of the analysis can get pretty complicated, I think at its core, these are two pretty simple ideas. In terms of access, we want to make our parks easy to use. We want to make them easy to visit and remove as many barriers as we can. We can't force people to get outside and play in our parks and sign up for our programs and get exercise and stay healthy, but we can at least make it as easy as possible for people to make that choice. And then in terms of equity, the test I always like to use is, again, pretty simple. It's just, are we being fair to the people that we're serving? Are we being fair when we're making planning decisions, when we're building and investing in new projects? Are we thinking about who we're serving? Are we serving the people who are going to rely the most on public resources and public spaces? And are we thinking fairly about where we're investing? Are we investing in the communities whose vulnerability to negative health outcomes is the highest? Things like chronic stress and depression, heart disease, childhood obesity. Some of the negative health outcomes you see in the infographic here, the sorts of outcomes that we think can really be helped with improved access to parks, walkable access to activity and exercise and outdoor recreation. Because by focusing on those people and those places, those communities that need it the most and will benefit the most, we're not just being nice. We're also going to be getting the greatest return on our investment of taxpayer money as a city. And we're also going to be able to move the dial on the city of Raleigh's ultimate public health and community well-being with the limited resources that we have available, and that's the case for every city, every public organization. And so I always like to start by highlighting our park system, our park department mission statement, which is bringing people to parks and parks to people. And I do think it's worth pausing on, because it's not just about bringing people to parks, about building places that are fun and attractive places to spend time. It's also about delivering parks to people. It's about making sure that our parks, our public spaces, our greenway trails are well integrated into people's everyday lives. We want parks to be located in places and surrounded by infrastructure so that it's safe for kids to walk there after school to meet friends. And we want our greenway trails to be integrated into our transportation network so that people can actually use them to safely walk or bike to work every day. We've got about 10,000 acres of land between our parks, nature preserves, and other open spaces, and 115 miles of trails throughout our park system. When you map it here, you can see how this creates an open space framework that the city can really organize itself around. We've got a lot of great interconnectivity within our park system, and for the most part, we're serving our citizens fairly well. But we're always looking for where we have gaps in that service. Where is our level of service not meeting the kinds of standards that we want? Ideally in Raleigh, what we're shooting for is ultimately to get every citizen within a 10-minute walk of a park. And that's difficult to do in a city like Raleigh that grew up so much in an era when urban planning was focused almost entirely on personal automobiles for transportation and circulation around the city. And so Raleigh wasn't designed to be a walkable place. It wasn't designed for mass transit. It really was designed for people to get around by car. And today we have a lot of people who are opting for more active forms of transportation, and when we're focusing much more on people who don't have a choice, who maybe can't operate or can't afford to own a personal automobile. And we really believe that the park system in particular has a role to step in and try to make up for some of those past planning decisions. So when it comes to how we measure level of service and park access, this is a shot taken from our park system plan back in the 1950s. And the way it was done back then was essentially you drew a circle around the park. If it was a bigger park, it got a bigger circle, and that was the service area. If you lived in there, you had access. If you lived outside of a service area, you didn't have access. Now, 50 years later, up until the early 2000s, things had gotten a little bit more sophisticated. We threw some more numbers in there, but ultimately the analysis was the same. It was a very binary. If you live inside this circle, this Euclidean radius service area, you had access. If you lived outside of it, you were unserved. And what I want to highlight is today some of the new ways that we're taking advantage of GIS technologies, other resources, other data that's out there to really take kind of a monumental leap forward beyond the way we've looked at things in the past. And in the end, what we end up with is a pretty nuanced and detailed level of service evaluation of our entire city, where we can assign a simple letter grade A through F that gives our staff and our elected officials a clear understanding of how well our park system is serving people in all different parts of the city. So to illustrate how this works, I'll step through an example. So this here is the census block that I live in, actually. And my closest park is Hill Street Park. This is a neighborhood park in the traditional way of looking at things and measuring access to a destination like a park. We would draw this radius service area around it. The neighborhood park would get a half-mile service area. Slightly larger community parks would get a 1 mile service area. And you can see I'm served by my park. You can see who's served by the surrounding areas. But in reality, that's not how people actually function. We rely much more on the distance you have to travel along an actual road network to determine what you have access to. And today, using network analysts and GIS, we can actually measure that and quantify that. So what we show here is the route that I would take to get to the access point at Hill Street Park. I have to travel a little over half a mile, about a 10-minute walk to get there. And we run this analysis again and again for every park in my vicinity. And each time my census block is being given a score based on the distance that I have to travel to get to that destination, and ultimately the quality of the experience I'll have once I get there. How big is the park? What variety of experiences will I be able to enjoy when I'm there? And we quantify and score all of these together and ultimately develop an overall level of service grade of how well that particular census block is served in our park system. And for mine personally, I get a level of service score of a B. We have a GIS model that replicates this analysis for all 6,000 or so census blocks in Raleigh, and we get this kind of a tapestry of park access level of service scores for each census block in the city. And you can see how they're graded here. And now I'd like to call out, if we look back at the service areas the way we used to look at it, you can see how the new approach, this access-based measurement, where we really consider the routes that people can take to get to these destinations, provides a much more detailed, nuanced understanding of park access. Take especially a look at the two parks here where you've got people whose level of service scores are actually in the D to F range, even though they're within these traditional radial service areas of the parks. And we'll walk through in a bit how we propose to address that through our Neighborhood and Community Connections program. And so again, to return, the ultimate product that we get out of this access-based analysis is this level of service map that shows scores throughout the city. And so through the Neighborhood and Community Connections program, we were looking for opportunities to improve level of service for people who lived nearby a park as the crow flies, but their actual access on the road network using the infrastructure that was available to them, access was actually very, very low. And so for us, this was an opportunity to improve level of service at a significant cost savings over traditionally what we would do is just need to acquire new park land and then plan and develop new parks. But for a fraction of the cost, we can really make those interventions in the infrastructure and the transportation network to boost level of service. And so the goals of the program here are to improve walkable access with a specific focus on health equity. This was something that for us was of paramount importance to the city of Raleigh as a whole, and in particular to our mission as the Parks Department, is that we wanted to focus on serving the communities most vulnerable to the negative health outcomes we talked about earlier: chronic stress and depression, childhood obesity, heart disease. Make sure we were investing in those communities and driving as much change in terms of public health and community well-being as we possibly could. And to do this, we really wanted to adopt a policy that was centered around a set of clear quantitative criteria to drive how we were funding these projects. We had received $1 million in a Parks bond referendum before we developed this program, and we wanted to figure out, okay, how are we going to distribute that $1 million across the entire city? We didn't want to just take a traditional approach of maybe spending an equal amount in each of our council districts. We didn't feel that would really be equitable, as opposed to really identifying and then focusing in on those communities that were going to benefit the most. So the quantitative criteria that we adopted, there are 3 of them I'll walk through. Them each one by one. So first of all, there's circuity. It's a measure of the efficiency of a network. And so what we do is we take the distance that you have to travel to get from point A to point B along a road network. We measure that distance and we compare it to the straight line distance that's available to you to get from your origin point to your destination. I'm going to pause here for just a moment to ask. I've got a pop-up saying I might be getting some network connectivity difficulty. Can you all still hear me and you're seeing my screen all right?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect, thank you. So to demonstrate again how we're measuring circuity throughout the city, I'll return back to the first census block that we looked at, and we'll compare it to one that's nearby, just about equal distance away from Hill Street Park. And if you'll recall back from our overall level of service evaluation, the second census block here has a very low level of service, and it's because of this access. And so to demonstrate the circuity measurement, you can see my route to Hill Street Park isn't perfectly straight, but it's relatively efficient. I don't have to go too far out of my way to get there. But when you compare that with the second census block, you can see it's an extremely circuitous, inefficient route. Because of how the road network is laid out, they have to travel actually over 1.5 miles to get to this park. That's really only a few hundred yards away if the infrastructure were there to support it. And so when you map this out across the entire city, we get this kind of heat map where the darkest areas are the most inefficient road networks. If you look toward the center of the map, that's downtown Raleigh. That's a part of the city that was developed much earlier, where we have a nice tight downtown grid network, plenty of sidewalks, plenty of opportunity, a very efficient pedestrian-friendly environment, and then so that shows up in the lighter colors. So that becomes the first layer of our evaluation. The second that we bring in is community vulnerability. And so this was a set of demographic analyses that were developed by our county's Health and Human Services Department to identify communities that were most vulnerable to, again, those negative health outcomes that we're trying to target here in the park system in Raleigh: chronic stress and depression, obesity, heart disease. And the demographic characteristics that they look at that are highly correlated with those outcomes are age dependency. So this is percentage of the population under 16 or over 65. Unemployment rates, percentage of the population living below the poverty level. Educational attainment, we look at the percentage that has achieved no higher than a high school diploma. And housing vacancy rates as a general indicator of disinvestment in certain communities. And we can map those at the census block group level throughout the city. That data is available at that scale. And you can see, again, some of the darker purple areas here highlighting those areas where we've got concentrations of all 5 of those demographic indicators in one area, in one neighborhood. And those are, again, some of the spaces that we feel our funding and our time and attention is best spent. And the final criteria that we use is an evaluation of pedestrian safety. And so we measure the safety of the route that you're most likely to take from your home, the center of your census block, to your nearest park. And for that, we looked at speed limits, presence or absence of sidewalks and crosswalks and other pedestrian infrastructure, and pedestrian vehicle crashes and fatality rates. And these, again, we partnered with our transportation department for this criteria, this measure, to make sure that something that was a priority for us would also be a priority for them. So that if we're looking to improve or construct a sidewalk extension to a nearby park, and that will also show up, that road could also show up on their priority list, which creates a lot more opportunities for shared funding, and really creates some better city-wide prioritization. And so again, when we compare these two census blocks, my route, actually I don't have sidewalks in my particular neighborhood, but the speed limits are very slow, the road capacity is extremely low, low traffic counts, no pedestrian accidents. People are pretty comfortable walking their dog, pushing strollers, walking on these streets. It's certainly not an ideal environment, but it is better than the second census block that actually has to walk out onto two major roads, neither of which have sidewalks, both of which experience high rates of pedestrian crashes and bicycle-related crashes. A very unattractive pedestrian environment, a really unsafe route. And so they would achieve some of the lowest scores in terms of this pedestrian safety ranking. And again, we run that analysis throughout the entire city, and that becomes the third layer. And so what we do is we rank and combine the pedestrian safety, circuity, and vulnerability scores, all three of those layers, and generate this composite map, which really highlights in the darkest red areas where all three of these factors show up together. And so those are the areas that we want to overlay with our park system, look at the parks that are located in those areas, and really call out some particular individual parks that we think might be candidates for a new connection. And so I'll highlight just one of those as an example of a project that we're going to be doing through this program that demonstrates some of the impact that it can have. And so that's Peach Road Park down in South Raleigh. What you see here are the access points to Peach Road Park, and the yellow dots represent the centroids of all the census blocks within a mile of that park. And the current network service area that we see, so people who can get there in about a 10 to 15 minute walk, you see about 750 people live in all of those census blocks, and we can model the routes that they would take to get there. Now you notice that some people had to go out onto, for us it's South Saunders Street, 70 is again one of those corridors that is an extremely unfriendly pedestrian environment. And it really creates, it's a big cutoff for a lot of people. Realistically, nobody's going to be walking that route. Almost everybody's going to have to rely on a vehicle if they want to be able to get to that park. And we can compare that with what happens if we open up a new access point on the southern end of the park that didn't exist before. The population living within that same network service area jumps up from 750 to almost 4,000. The safety score for all of those people improves dramatically. You can see again as we illustrate what those routes might look like. Many more people can rely on smaller, lower volume roads with better pedestrian infrastructure, neighborhood streets to get out to this park, rather than relying on going out onto a road that really is only designed for vehicles. And when you take a look at the satellite imagery, you can see that this was kind of a no-brainer, but also one that if we didn't take this particular perspective, probably wouldn't have come up as a priority project for us in the city. And so what we're proposing to do now is just to create this new access point to a high-density housing development that came in south of the park years after the park was built, but somewhere that we never actually extended that pedestrian network, that pedestrian infrastructure into the park to actually provide access. When you take a Google Street View, look at what's going on, there was actually a barrier created preventing people from accessing the park. And I wish that this was something that wasn't as common as it is, but really cities all across the country make these kind of common sense mistakes all the time, ourselves included, when we're not willing to revisit how we usually plan things. But when we take an approach where we're designing things for access and designing things for equity, it can really transform the way that we're building public infrastructure, whether it's parks or roads, sidewalks and bike lanes, the way that we think about how our resources are integrated into the surrounding communities. And that for us, moving beyond just the Neighborhood and Community Connections program has really transformed how we're thinking about some of those concepts overall from a park development and park system planning perspective. And to close, I just wanted to highlight just a few lessons that we learned working through the Neighborhood and Community Connections program. First of all, as I mentioned, the idea of designing for access and equity in pretty much everything that we do now, where we're offering programs, where we're buying land. We're always prioritizing based on the demographics of the community that we think we have a responsibility to serve, and to make sure that we're doing it in a way that people will have a universal set of options for access, whether it's walking or biking, compatible for everybody's different needs, beyond just people who rely on a car to get around. Second, I want to highlight, because I know, again, many of you listening aren't involved directly in parks and recreation, but the value that your skills and your background, whether you're in public health or transportation, whether you do GIS analysis, there are partner organizations out there, many other parks departments in most cities, honestly, that don't have the access to the knowledge and skills and capacity that you could probably bring to the table. So I would just encourage you all to think about reaching out and making some firmer connections, whether it's with a local parks department or planning department, other organizations that are outside of your area, because without the help of our transportation partners and our partners in our public health department, we never would have been able to develop as sophisticated and as nuanced of an analysis on our own as we did through those partnerships. And finally, I want to highlight the impact that having clear quantitative criteria that we use to determine priorities, just how helpful that has been. You know, when you start talking about health equity and health outcomes, that really is bigger than politics. It's something that everybody can agree on. And I think for us, we've found that by getting these criteria quantified and adopted, things that everybody could agree on, it's helped kind of insulate some of the planning from other assumptions that we might make about who we need to serve and where we need to make an investment. And it helps people kind of rise above just advocating for their individual neighborhood or their constituents or their community, and really thinking more about what's best in terms of public health and community well-being for the city as a whole. And with that, I'll go ahead and close. I look forward to the rest of the discussion and would be happy to take any questions when we get there. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, TJ, for a great presentation. Really enjoyed seeing about the work you guys are doing in Raleigh. So we do have about 25 minutes left for discussion right now, and we got lots of questions ahead of time, and many questions came in during the webinar, so we'll try to get through as many as we can. First, I'm hoping this is a pretty quick answer from Ken. We had a couple people ask if there was some additional information you could share about the grant program for the Savannah example that you showed. I'm guessing people are curious whether it's still available and maybe a timeline for submitting requests.
Yeah, this is Ken. So unfortunately, for those that want to submit an application immediately, that grant is not open. It will be, it's a 5-year cycle, so we just funded the first year last fall. You know, we never know what's going to happen from an appropriations perspective at the federal level, and it could be that we may open it in the future if we've got increased resources. So I think the answer would be just keep checking our website, or we can certainly get an announcement out to PBIC should that mechanism open up again. Having said that, Through our state health department announcement, which is called State Physical Activity and Nutrition, if you just Google CDC, State Physical Activity and Nutrition, state and local programs, you can get a link to those the people who are funded. In those states, they are the grant guidance does suggest that 20% of that funding go to local areas. And so if you are within one of those states, there certainly is an opportunity to work with your state health department at the local level. And then if you happen to be in a county with 40% more obesity, then contacting your land-grant university and checking to see if there's projects or your cooperative extension agent in your county would be an option. So just to put a fine point on it, we will work, if we do get an updated opportunity for funding through racial ethic approaches to community health, we'll definitely make sure that we get that out through the PBIC network.
Okay, great. Yeah, we appreciate that. Our quarterly newsletter would be a great avenue for that, and I'm guessing a lot of the people on the webinar today already received the newsletter, and if not, you can find it on the homepage of pedbikeinfo.org. So for Chris and Ken, we got quite a few questions about creating active routes in rural communities, and a few people wondering about community engagement, community input for multi-community planning efforts. I guess crossing agencies, crossing different municipal boundaries. So are there examples of communities that you have worked with that you want to highlight on those topics, or maybe some of the guides that Chris was showing? Anything that you can call out on rural communities or community engagement?
Sure, this is Chris. I'll take a first stab at those two, and then Ken can chime in. We're pretty confident that the broad concept of activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations applies even in a rural context, because all of us have to-do lists, and most people have to go places, whether it's work, school, or to shop on a regular basis. But in rural settings, the distances for a significant portion of the trip may be longer than people can walk or bike. So an example that I'll use from Mississippi is that after Katrina, the 3 counties that are along the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, all of which share one transit system, decided that they did some community engagement and discovered that many people would be willing to ride their bikes in their home neighborhoods and in nearer their destinations if they could get there across the 3 counties. So they put bike racks on all of the buses on the cross-county bus routes, and they adopted what I think of as a first mile, last mile kind of solution. People rode their bikes to the bus stop, put their bikes on the bus, took a 20-mile bus ride, then took the bikes off and rode them around at their destination when they were shopping or at work or whatever the destination was. And those bus routes, it's my understanding, are now the single most populated bus routes, most used bus routes in the whole system. So that's one option, is to focus on the activity friendliness of the first mile, last mile kind of situation, and create the connections through transit that you might be able to do. Another example, Teton County, Wyoming, has near Jackson Hole, has what's called the Pathways program. And because they had so many outlying small communities, whether it be small towns or ski areas or whatever, and that people really liked to walk, hike, or bike in those areas, they've created a network of off-road, but not out of sight of the road, biking and walking trails that connect all of these places into Jackson Hole, where many of the people who are at the ski areas or otherwise need to periodically go. And so they've actually found a way to scale it up where you have activity-friendly routes the entire distance. So those are just two examples of how you deal with the rural settings. I think it's very context sensitive in the sense that you do need to do community engagement to figure out what will work in a given place and what people are interested in. As far as the other question goes about sort of the intersectoral partnerships, we have multiple community engagement tools that I'm happy to share with the PBIC folks to send out. All of them talk about the importance of, and in public health, this is called health in all policies, the importance of having a multi-sector coalition. And so what we have found is that most of the professions or sectors now have policy statements or elements of their code of ethics that literally say they need to address health and safety issues, and they need to do it in partnership with public health. And so those can be, using those policy statements or codes of ethics is a way to make inroads with sectors that you're not aware of. Public Health Code of Ethics and the American Public Health Association have policy statements like that for those on the webinar that are from the transportation or public works sectors, and the public works and transportation sectors, including ITE, for instance, have policy statements that point that out. So that would be my first suggestion on how to build those bridges across sectors. Ken, do you have anything you want to add?
I think in the interest of time, I think you definitely handled it pretty well.
Thank you, guys. One of our participants just mentioned the FHWA Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks resource that came out in 2016. I think that would be a great thing for folks to take a look at if you're not familiar with it. And that actually brings me back to, we got quite a few questions ahead of time about, identifying routes, prioritizing routes, and even deciding on the design for active transportation facilities. So rather than kicking that question back to the panelists, I just want to say that in addition to some of the resources that Chris showed us today, FHWA, through the livability team and the safety office, has put out quite a few resources over the last few years addressing those topics. So I would take a look at the FHWA website, and some of those resources have also been featured on PBIC webinars. So if you look at the archived webinars, that would be a good starting place if you're thinking about identifying routes and some of the design details for those routes. I'm going to bring it back to TJ now. Let me see. So we got a question about the Peach Park example that you showed, and if they were asking if there was any neighborhood opposition to establishing new connections, and then a related question about the maintenance implications for creating new connections to parks, maybe in situations where the connections are more informal, created by the neighbors. So yeah, if there's anything you'd like to say on those topics.
Yeah, so I'll say, first of all, as far as the community participation component of any of these projects, that's always going to be a huge and necessary part of the process. So like the model that I showed, the quantitative criteria, those are part of the equation. But with any planning decision, of course, we would go and make sure that this is something that was really appropriate for the community, appropriate for the neighborhood, and something that people would actually want and would use. So the model, the quantitative criteria, our prioritization ranking is a tool to help us focus in on some of the highest priority projects. And so now that we've done that part, and as we start moving forward and to starting to think about designing and actually constructing some of these routes, the next part that we'll do is that community engagement piece. We just haven't gotten there yet. The first step for us was the analysis. And then as far as some of the maintenance concerns for some of these new connections, I would say, yes, definitely. We need to be very intentional, both in terms of how we design these things and in terms of what some unintended consequences might be, whether that's from a security and safety perspective or an accessibility perspective, in terms of thinking about universal design principles, and to make sure that some of those things are possible to incorporate and that we've really thought through all of those issues. But that said, yeah, as part of this program, one of the things that we're looking at doing is identifying some informal trails, some goat paths. They get called a lot of different things, but some of the connections that people kind of make on their own, just kind of walking through the woods to get to a park. Looking at opportunities for how we can formalize some of those to make sure that they're well maintained, make sure that they're safe, and make sure that they're accessible for more people.
Great. We also got a question about, I know you talked about pedestrian safety as one of the criteria that you were looking at, but did you look at anything else about the pedestrian and bicycling experience along the route? The person specifically asking about attractive land uses or perception of safety, as well as once you get to the destination.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. And for this first iteration of the project, no, those were the three criteria that I listed during the presentation were the three that we used. What we're actually getting ready to do this year is we're developing a whole new master plan for our Greenways Trail system. And through that, one of the things that we expect to do is incorporate new criteria, some of which are exactly what the question touched on in terms of the pedestrian experience along the route, the different types of land uses that might get connected, and that's where you're getting a little bit more into the realm of transportation planning, and where our partnerships with our transportation department are really going to come into play as we look for ways to kind of better integrate the planning we're doing here in parks with the planning being done in transportation and in comprehensive planning throughout the city. So yeah, looking to incorporate.
Go ahead.
The first iteration, we kind of had to stick with what was available to us at the time.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to say about how this program maybe continued the way that the Parks Department had worked with the Transportation Department in the past, or was it really like forging a new aspect of the relationship, working on this program together?
Yeah, I can say at least in my personal experience in terms of the relationships that myself and my staff has built with some of our colleagues in other departments, it really has kind of been a game changer. And honestly, those relationships have just helped us kind of highlight other opportunities that have come up. The just general level of collaboration, I think, that came out of having a successful partnership project like this really has continued some momentum and kind of set up a new expectation that rather than working independently just on our own, it's just much more natural for us now to kind of, get on the elevator, go down to the different floor, or walk over to the other building, or shoot an email to somebody just to kind of get their perspective on some ideas. And yeah, it's honestly, it's gotten like a lot of really good feedback where we've also been able to, like I said, that while some of this analysis was designed specifically with parks as the destination in mind, we've started working with GIS staff and some of our other city departments on how those ideas can be ported over for different types of analysis, and the methodology can be changed up to suit whatever their needs are. I'll say in particular, probably what's had the biggest overall impact is a focused effort on a way to quantify some of the social equity and health equity concepts that we talked about. I think that's something that's been important from a policy level to the city for a very long time, but it's difficult sometimes to really quantify that and to make that something that's more than just, but that can actually be applied and used as a way to prioritize capital projects and plans and funding projects. And so by setting up an example of a way that you can quantify some of those social equity goals that you have, I think that's something that's been used in a lot of different ways within our department now, and is getting used throughout the city, actually, on some other projects as well.
And this is Ken. I was just going to add that Nashville has done a similar method to identify socially vulnerable communities. So it is definitely a method that can be used to try to target resources.
Yeah, thanks for talking through the example and explaining what the city might be looking to next. We did get a question about how this might apply to access to transit. So it's nice to hear that you guys are taking some of these pieces and looking at other destinations within the community. Ken, if you're still off mute for a second, we got a question. I think this goes back to some of the introductory material that you presented. Question asking about, I guess, kind of the trade-off, of concurrently encouraging people to walk and bike while still trying to get some of the infrastructure in place. So I guess the safety concern of asking people to get out there and walk and bike while maybe still playing catch up on the infrastructure side of things. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that. I mean, I understand the concern.
Well, I think this is Ken. I think one of the things that we're advocating is that, we need to create safe and convenient opportunities for physical activity. And we're not advocating for someone to get on a 4-lane arterial at 55 miles an hour with no sidewalk or shoulder and ride their bicycle. That is not what we're trying to say here. So if anyone heard that, just let me be clear. That's not what I'm advocating as a public health professional. That said, there are a lot of people that do have to do that because they have no other choice. And so, that's another reason why it's really important to improve these environments. So, I think, if you do have places that are impacted like this, you get a bang for your buck in investing. So not only are you going to make it safer for people that already have to use this infrastructure, but you're creating opportunities for other people to be physically active. But no, when we talk about this, what we talk about is we want you to do a couple things. One, make the route itself active friendly, and then create the accessible destination through land use policies. If you do one of those, if you do something from each menu, then by definition, it will be a safer route and thus something that can improve physical activity.
And this is Chris, just to follow up on that. If certain things are going to take a while and you have an entire long route that you've prioritized activities on, but it's not all connected or all safe, I'll point out one Safe Routes to School, active travel to school intervention that some places are beginning to use. Basically, they realized that the distances for many places or the safety issues along the route from some students' houses to the schools would prevent safe walking or biking. But even for the students who ride the bus, what some of the school systems are doing is they're having the buses drop off not in front of the school, but at designated locations some distance away from the school where they've entered a safe zone, and then the kids can walk or bike from those spots. And so that, I think that applies to other things. If you're working with your public health people to activate a corridor that isn't completely safe at a given moment, you can still try to get people to use the portions of the area or the corridor that are safe.
Yeah, and I would just add one other thing to this. Different communities are at different places on this continuum. And so, strategies that Chris just mentioned or some types of strategies that people use. There's policies that school use, for example, to change drop off and then, or pick up. And so kids that walk can get out 5 minutes earlier. And if they don't have a safe environment, they walk to a remote pickup zone that is safe to get to. Another example is many of y'all are probably familiar with is thinking through creating open streets days where you close streets off to car traffic and show people what it would be like to have a safe environment that helps generate public support for this infrastructure. And then finally, as Chris mentioned, there are opportunities and places to do quick builds where maybe with less expensive materials, you can implement activity-friendly routes more quickly.
Great, thanks. TJ, we have a couple of questions about methodology. It sounds like some people are ready to jump on their computer and get started trying to work on something like you've got going in Raleigh, but can you quickly say if there was some programs or some tools that you used besides GIS or the network analysis tool? I think there's just anything else you want to mention now about the methodology?
Yeah. So if anybody has specific questions, I think my email address is listed here. Feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll be able to do the best we can to help you all out. We're more than happy to share some of the details of what we've done. I guess one thing worth highlighting is some of the things that Esri has added to their ArcGIS Online capabilities and their community analyst tool set is really so much more accessible and intuitive and easy to use for people who aren't necessarily full-time GIS professionals. And yeah, the amount of data and the accessibility of that data and the types of analyses that you can do just online in a web browser now without needing to have an actual ArcGIS Pro or ArcGIS for Desktop license is far and away much better than it was even just 4 or 5 years ago. And so that's one thing that we didn't necessarily rely on for developing this model. But when we want to do a quick little check on something, like say we're looking at a potential park land acquisition opportunity and we want to know, okay, what are some of the demographic characteristics of the community in that area? It's so easy for us to do now just in ArcGIS Online, when in the past we probably would have had to put together a request for our GIS staff and let them work through it and have it be more of an iterative process, where now it's something that really our whole organization can kind of have at their fingertips. And so that's one resource that I'd say has really been pretty great for us, kind of carrying forward some of the principles that we developed here. But yeah, again, feel free to shoot me an email if you've got more specific methodological questions. I'd be happy to help.
Okay, wonderful. And as TJ mentioned, all the email addresses are up on the screen right now. We're just about out of time, so just want to remind you guys that you'll receive an email later today with a link to the archive page, as well as instructions for downloading your certificate of attendance. And when you guys are ready to close your browser window, you will see a brief survey pop up. We would appreciate your feedback and comments on today's presentation. We have some great panelists with us today and a lot of great questions. I apologize if we didn't get to all the questions. So thank you again to our panelists for their presentations, and thanks to all of you for attending today's PBIC webinar. Hope you have a great day, and we are signing off. Thank you.